All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Max Altman, and I'm going to be presenting you with this fascinating paper dealing with the experiences of those on DMT, specifically dealing with entity encounter experiences. So the catalyst for this study is they found that those who have inhaled DMT, some of them have been reporting encounters with seemingly autonomous entities. And the aim of this study was to try and characterize the different subjective experiences, interpretations, and persisting changes that people attribute to these DMT-based entity encounter experiences. In terms of how I'm going to go through this presentation, I'm going to start with kind of a quick overview of what DMT is. Then I'm going to go through the methods of the study, and then I'm going to do results and discussion at the same time, because the data found in this study is mostly descriptions of the experience, and any notable findings to think about are best understood in real time with each set of the results. And then finally, I'll finish off with some potential harms and study limitations. So DMT, which is pictured to the right, the full name is N-dimethyltryptamine. It occurs naturally in a variety of animal and plant species, including ourselves. There's a whole host of intense subjective effects that are associated with DMT, but kind of the clear staple umbrella effects that are attributed to it are having vivid mental imagery, perceptual and time distortions, changes in thought patterns, and heightened emotional states. When it's taken intravenously through an injection or it's inhaled, the peak effects typically occur within 5 minutes or so, and the entire experience is typically resolved within 30 minutes. Its main site of actions, there's several, one of them being serotonin 2A. In simplest terms, one of the things this deals with is the central nervous system. It affects how we behave, it affects learning, and as well is thought to be one of the causes of a lot of the subjective visual effects that are seen. As well, it's an active ingredient in ayahuasca. Ayahuasca, it's a brew of Southern American origin known to induce incredibly intense psychedelic experiences and often used in spiritual practices. And then interestingly, the endogenous presence of DMT, which means that it actually exists within us, there has been speculation that it may explain a variety of kind of non-ordinary states of consciousness, from dreaming to some different kinds of trances. So there's many words that are associated with DMT. A recent study was done trying to kind of bring these into a concrete list, and these are the main ones they came up with. And I just want to draw attention specifically to ineffability, which means incapable of being expressed or described in words, because what it suggests is that there's great difficulty with those who experience these effects when they're trying to describe it. And also that's something to think about kind of when we go through the study. And as well at the very bottom, in reports of entering other realities that were sometimes inhabited by other sentient beings, these are the entity encounters that the study is referring to. And when we're talking about dosages, in general, in formal terms, it's typically referred to as a sub-breakthrough dose or a breakthrough dose. And a breakthrough dose is one that kind of gets you into experiencing a whole host of effects that are beyond what a lower dose would give you. So kind of characteristic of what's referred to as a breakthrough is having very strong psychoactive effects, hallucinations and distortions that replace your entire exterior environment in all capacities, feeling of entering a new space. Some have referred to it as a new dimension or reality. And it is at this kind of state where individuals may report interacting with entities. So the format of the present study, it was an anonymous internet survey taken from an international sample of individuals who reported having both encountered an entity and having done so at a breakthrough dose. And the method of DMT they used was either it was vaporized or it was smoked. There were 2,561 people in this study out of about 20,000 who clicked on. So the number was reduced heavily for a bunch of exclusion criteria. Some of this is because they didn't meet the eligibility requirements, if they were below 18, if they weren't fluent in English, and if they just generally didn't have an entity encounter at all. if they had a prior diagnosis of a psychotic disorder, if they had another substance at the same time, or if the way that they administered DMT was not through smoking or vaporizing. Other methods include oral, intranasal, intravenous. When they were analyzing the data, the whole study was in the form of a survey. So there were two portions to this. The first was a brief written description of their single most memorable experience. And that's important to keep in mind because there was no questions relating to their other experiences of encountering an entity if they had had those. And then afterwards, a series of questions about the various aspects of their experience and what their respective interpretations were. The questions for the second half were derived from a modified version of another survey that was looking at those who expressed that they had had encounters with God in a non-drug context. The coding process for this, the way that the researchers took this data and got results out of it was they would take the non-numerical data, so these open-ended responses people were giving, and they would create a list of relevant themes that they found throughout. And then they would look at the amount of themes that were present in each of these writings, and they would calculate the proportion that these themes showed themselves when connected to the overall sample. And the agreement on the ratings given from the multiple authors was very high. It was about 94 to 95%. So the demographics, the majority of the participants were male, Caucasian, never married, and lived in the US. This does initially appear disproportionate. The study does make mention that this demographic in particular does appear to have to use DMT more anyway. However, it still is very much the majority in this one specific area. The average age of those involved was about 32. What's interesting is that the average use, so the amount of times that a respondent had taken DMT is 14.5 times. However, the median was 6. So what that essentially means is that half the people in this study took DMT 6 or less time, and half the people in the study took 6 or more times, suggesting that the majority of those in the study, or half of them, had taken far less times, but perhaps if the average is still 14.5, there must be a certain percentage of those in the study at a kind of a skewed angle who had taken maybe 10, 20, 30 or more times. But the study doesn't really go into details on the specifics of how that distribution lies beyond that. As well, 67% of those in the study selected their first entity encounter experience as being their most memorable and the one that they would talk about. And 56% of those in the study had claimed to have had other entity encounters either before or after the experience. So there were several different ways that communication took place. 69% of those in the study said that the entity was the one that initiated the communication. 21% of those in the study said that it was their intention going in that started that communication. In terms of the direction of the communication, 49% said that it was simply just the entity to the respondent, whereas 40% said it was a two-way communication. Very few, it was only about 2% of the respondents said that it was just them towards the entity. In terms of the senses that were involved in the interaction, the most common one was their visual sense, then extrasensory, like telepathic, maybe through the mind, then auditory, then touch, and finally smell. And in terms of how that actual communication took place, how they were able, information came across between the respondent and the entity, the most common was through telepathic extrasensory means, then visually through gestures, and then verbally through spoken language, and then touch, and then the least common was through some other mode. And what's interesting is that the two most common methods of communication here are also the most common forms of communication for non-drug entity encounters. And I'll explain kind of what a non-drug entity encounter means a little bit on. So in terms of visual descriptors, I have a list on the left side that kind of goes through what in their responses the respondents had said they had seen. But what's notable is that the top 5 are all very non-specific, and this also matches up with other non-drug entity encounters, which are things like reported alien abductions, interaction with UFOs, meeting entities in near-death experiences, God encounters. Unfortunately, the researchers said that they never coded for whether or not God or ultimate reality or higher power was given as some sort of a description. However, that parallel is interesting. In terms of emotional responses, the vast majority of respondents said that they had an emotional response, 99%, the most common being joy, and then trust, surprise, love. And I've highlighted love there because even though it's the fourth most common, it was the most prominent emotion. As well, the two most common negative emotions that were found were fear and distrust. But the researchers believe that a reason for that may have been the initial confusion or surprise associated with the entity encounter. And also very interesting is that the emotional responses also carried over from the entity's perspective as well. 58% of respondents said that the entity experienced an emotional response, love being the most prominent, and any of the emotions that kind of had a more negative tone seemed to be far less frequent, all under about 2%. So this is a huge graph right here. I'm just going to draw attention to several portions of it. This is kind of looking at what are the metaphysical conceptions of reality. How has this shifted as a result of the experience? So the first thing I found very interesting was that 81% said that the experience felt more real to them during than their everyday waking consciousness. And even after the experience, 65% still felt the same. As well, only 9% of the participants said that the experience seemed to consist or exist within themselves. So the vast majority of people in the study felt that to some degree or another dimension or another reality was involved with this entity. As well, 80% of those in the study said that it altered their fundamental conception of reality, which it's hard to overstate how intense of a claim that is. But very interestingly as well, it was only 1% that said that this alteration was undesirable. The majority was either desirable or neutral. And when talking about the attributes of the entity encounters, conscious or being self-aware and intelligent were the most common ones that were found. And what I found very interesting is at the bottom, religious identification before and after the encounter is quite significant, and it all seems to trend towards more of a belief in God or an ultimate reality or some sort of theism. You can see the level of atheism goes down from 28% to 10%. Agnosticism goes down, and these are quite significant shifts as a result of their experiences. So one way to phrase this is what the researchers refer to as ontological shock, which simply means the state of being forced to question one's worldview. This is derived from the word ontology, it's the philosophical study of being. And in this case, believing in the reality of entities is something that would trigger this sort of shock. But what the researchers were also commenting on, kind of getting into the territory of where therapeutic potential may lie, is that ontological shock has been thought to promote something called psychological flexibility. That's defined as kind of the extent to which a person can cope with changes in circumstances. It typically refers to times when stressors or unexpected events occur, requiring a person to change their stance, outlook, or commitment. And a lot of clinical trials dealing with the therapeutic potential of psychedelics attribute that therapeutic potential to an increase in psychological flexibility. As well, what was fascinating is how many respondents talked about getting some sort of message, task, mission, purpose, or insight from the entity. The two most common variations of this were idiosyncratic information and personal insights. Idiosyncratic information really just means kind of things that weren't captured by themes. They're vague, non-specific sort of communications and insights. And then personal insights are things that are specifically directed at personal behaviors, emotional relationships, life purpose. It's specific instructions. And here's some representative quotes that are associated with these. One of these was, he was teaching me the rules and regulations of the NFL. Another respondent said, she said, you finally found me. In terms of personal insights, someone reported, I learned that when I resist uncomfortable emotions, I'm selling myself short of the possibility to learn and grow. Another individual said, I'd been struggling with addiction of opiates at the time. She basically told me that I really needed to cut it out of my life because all it will bring is pain. I had not previously thought about my use of opiates before this encounter. Another kind of category is predictions about the future. This was at a lesser rate, but still 19% is pretty significant. And the most common form that this took was regarding personal life events, which the study defines as predictions about relationships, personal behaviors, or one's life path or purpose. Here's some more representative quotes associated with that. One is saying, I was shown how my life will be without my addiction and how my loved ones will suffer less. I was shown past mistakes and how to rectify them. Another individual said, I was shown the way my life was heading into further depression and potential suicide and how it would impact my family, and I was going to be alone unless I made some changes. So now this last kind of piece of data is looking specifically at kind of overall summary effects of the experience. In the top left, you can see when talking about the top 5 of their life, the majority found it to be one of the most personally meaningful, significant, insightful experiences they've had. And a lot of this lines up with the data that came earlier. So when you look at psychologically challenging, for example, that aligns with the fear and distrust that was reported in the emotional response. When you look at psychologically insightful, that has a lot to do with the messages and predictions that were found. Because a lot of these messages and predictions appear to deal with things to do with self-development, potentially increasing what these researchers are referring to as psychological insight, another aspect as well as psychological flexibility, which is thought to be responsible for a lot of the positive enduring changes and therapeutic benefits of these experiences. Another interesting thing to note as well is the impact of these experiences in very general terms. They're notably similar to both non-drug entity encounters and other psychedelic experiences like those from psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, and ayahuasca. So it is also important to talk about the potential flaws and harms that take place in the study, one of which right away is the lack of negative responses. It's very likely that those with negative experiences may have been less likely to respond and or wanted to participate. As well, a lot of these respondents had experienced these effects of DMT many, many times, and there's no guarantee that their most memorable experience also equated to their most harmful or was even a harmful experience. As well, beyond that, such vast changes in someone's worldview or their faith, the value judgments on that is very, very subjective. For some, they may see that as a positive. Some they may see it as a negative. And I mean, it talked about fundamental shifts in reality, and we saw that very few seem to see was undesirable, but that's still a meaningful number. And as well, there are some potential dangers that are noted with ontological shock and having your worldview change so quickly from under you. And they were saying that to be taken they phrased it further away from reality, there is the potential for it to lead to some sort of physical or psychological harm. And it would be interesting in the future to research if the way these changes in belief interact with the development of any sort of psychiatric illness or predispose someone towards harm. So these are kind of the flaws and harms that are discussed on the part of the study. But one thing that I thought was also very interesting and worth talking about is interpreting the data here with a lot of care. What I mean by that is only 1% found it undesirable, but this isn't 1% felt nausea or experienced migraines. This is 1% said their fundamental conception of reality was shifted in an undesirable way. And again, that can't really be overstated how significant that is. And just because it's a far lower number doesn't mean it should be disregarded anymore as a result. And similarly, the two most common ways that the entities were described was conscious and intelligent. And the least common in the list of 11 they gave were the two negative ones, negatively judgmental and malicious. And it's easy to kind of see the 9 above and go, well, this is clearly the least frequent. However, it's likely that cases of dealing with what people have perceived to be a malicious entity can result in some very terrifying experiences and be a reason for certain undesirable effects. Another thing to mention too is the recruitment was done from relevant forums on Facebook and Reddit, other websites like Motherboard and DMT Nexus. And these are places where typically those who use these sites are already very curious about DMT. They like talking about it. And again, that kind of goes into how those with more negative experiences may have been less likely to report. So ultimately, even though these results are incredibly promising, especially on the therapeutic front, I also think it's very vital we don't neglect the signs of where serious caution should be exercised. In terms of the limitations of the study itself, there's several that they go into. One is that recall can be unreliable. The second is that these results do not allow for causal interpretations, i.e. This experience, the setting in which the DMT was taken has led to an encounter with X sort of entity. Individuals from other backgrounds may have been less willing to participate. Again, the demographics were very predominantly from the US, white, male. Multiple substance users likely still had very relevant experiences to share. The most memorable is not necessarily the most representative, especially in the cases when you consider that the average is 14 and a half. It's very likely that their most memorable is not the one that represents the vast amount of experiences that those individuals may have had. And as well, the study doesn't allow for comment on the prevalence of DMT entity encounters. In conclusion, this is the largest study to date providing detailed information about the experiences, interpretations, and persisting changes attributed to reports about encounters with entities after inhaling DMT. And for future directions, it would be interesting to study the effects of different dosages and looking at brain activity and how it may provide a unique window into the nature of these fascinating experiences. So that brings us to the end. I'm happy to take any questions, but some theoretical questions I kind of put up to think about as well that struck me as interesting are, how are these qualitative terms defined? Love, for example, doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to everyone. I also think it's be interesting to look into how we could correlate the visual descriptions of these entities with the specific experiences they have. Presumably, the 2% who said the entity looked like the devil or a monster would be in the more negative side of things, and the one that described it as an angel or a helper would be in the positive. And also, I think it's interesting, what are the implications that these entity encounters always seem to, or at least the vast majority of the time, seem to be the entity imparting some sort of knowledge to the one taking it. And yeah, that's all.